Hi, I'm Amber Schrader, Executive Director of Badgers United, and you are listening to The Flagship, where we discuss what our flagship university needs to be successful. Today, we are joined by Katherine Lyall, a former president of the University of Wisconsin system. She served in that capacity for 12 years and oversaw an increase in funding for our UW system programs by attracting new grants and private donations. Well, thank you for joining us today, Katherine.
Thanks for inviting me.
Before we dive into the meat of our conversation, let's talk a little bit about you. You originally came to UWMadison as an economics professor in 1982. What was the school like at that time?
Well, I actually came as the academic vice president of the system, and I had an academic appointment in the economics department at Madison. The system was smaller then, somewhat, not a great deal in terms of enrollments, but it was a very vibrant place. Faculty governance was alive and well and working. And we were on the brink, this was in the 80s, we were on the brink of a growth spurt in the research functions of the university and in the expansion of the program array for students into areas like computer science, which were brand new at that time. So it was a very exciting place to come and be. I had been at Johns Hopkins before that, and I had had a position in the Carter administration for a while. So I had some government experience. I had some private university experience. And it was a great pleasure and surprise to me to see what a great university this was and how much it was growing at that time. So it's a great time to be there. It's a great time to be here now.
It's always a good time to be in Madison. You, like so many of us, including me, came to Madison, fell in love with it, and made your career here in Wisconsin. What kept you here?
The quality of the university and the support of the state for the university. I came here from the East Coast, as I just mentioned, and on the East Coast, private universities are a much bigger part of the higher education landscape. In the Midwest, and Wisconsin, of course, is part of that, public universities historically have been the mainstay of higher education and access to opportunities for students. So being part of that and seeing the quality of the faculty here and the quality of the academic work that was being done and the excitement of the students who came was really all of a piece in keeping me in the state.
That's awesome.
I like cheese, too.
Like any good Wisconsinite. You served as UW system president for 12 years. Is there an achievement or experience you're particularly proud of?
Well, two things occur to me. A lot happens in 12 years, but the Board of Regents and I worked very hard during that period of time to position the UW system as an engine for economic development and growth in the state. And we had a series of, I think it was 5 statewide economic summits that occurred 5 years in a row. Both the public sector and the private sector participated in that. It got some national notice as well. And it was able to raise and discuss policy issues that essentially went to the heart of how can the university be more helpful to the state and its economic growth plans. There were many people who participated in those summits over the years, and I think it had an impact. And each one of the campuses in the system participated then locally in follow-up activities. So that was something that I thought was well worth the time and effort it took, and I think it has had lasting legs, as you would say, in the entertainment business. The other thing that I feel very happy about is simply that I signed something like 350,000 diplomas during that period of time. And that is at bottom, of course, what the university is about, is providing educational opportunity for students and getting them launched into a world where they can be productive and great citizens. So it seems like an ordinary part of the job, and it was an ordinary part of the job, but I was really proud of that, those 350,000 students, and I expect every one of them, if they're out there listening, to live up to that.
I think that would be really rewarding. It's just like you're really seeing the work pay off, right? Every time a diploma crosses your desk. So you also serve on Badgers United Board of Directors. And as a UW system president, you bring an interesting perspective to our board. Why do you think that this organization is important right now?
Well, I think we're in a period, and this is certainly true in the state, but it may be true nationally as well, where higher education is being increasingly pushed to the back of people's agendas and discussions. And there are all kinds of other issues, financial and otherwise, that are driving the public discourse now. And it's important there be voices that remind everyone that without that educational backbone, as a society and as an economy, we're not going much of anywhere. And I'm well aware of all the criticisms of higher education, and it does too much of this and too little of that and so on. But in the end, if you sit down and say, what is the single most important asset the state of Wisconsin has for its economic future? It's higher education. And I mean both the university and private colleges and universities and the tech college system. Those are all a piece of the important asset that higher education can bring to the state. Without it, I'm not sure where we'd be. So
I think you bring up some interesting points about misconceptions out there. One of the very common narratives in the national media is student debt and the crisis it's causing. UW-Madison, we see 53% of students graduate with zero debt. Those that do have less than $30,000. What's your perspective on student debt?
Well, if you actually look at the background of the numbers that are reported nationally, those shockingly high numbers are often associated with the expensive elite private universities in this country. And I'm not making a judgment one way or the other about those universities, but $100,000 debt, coming out of undergraduate school isn't something you find generally in, I think, most public universities. And in Wisconsin and UW-Madison, those numbers are very much less than that. And we have and always have had very low default rates on student loans. It is something that people borrow for knowingly, I think, appreciating the value of what they're investing in. And there are always instances, unforeseen, in which somebody gets sick or there's a family crisis, something happens that makes you unable to repay that debt. But in Wisconsin, that is not the norm at all. We pay our debts. Students live up to their obligations, and their families do. And I think you want to be careful how much you borrow. We are not in the same position as some of these horror cases that you hear about.
Yeah, I think the data really supports that, what you're saying. Other misconceptions that exist out there is that Madison is just for Dane County. UW-Madison is just a Dane County thing. What do you think about that?
Well, of course it's not. If you look at the backgrounds of their existing student body, you can see that it's not. It serves statewide, nationally, and internationally. It has kept an important part of its mission as serving residents of the state. It should, I think, and it does. But the purpose of all the other campuses in the system has been to make it easier for access for people in the outer parts of the state. And some of those students decide to come to Madison. Some of them decide to go to Oshkosh or Platteville or Eau Claire or Whitewater or any of the other campuses that have very fine programs as well.
So I think you bring up these other schools, and it leads us to a tough conversation that is increasingly necessary around capacity in our state. Is the current model we're using as a state in higher ed sustainable, in your opinion?
Let me come at that from a slightly different angle. It's clear that the demographics of the state are driving a lot of changes right now, and that is a decline in the traditional college-age student population. And that decline is projected to continue for another 12 or 15 years. So this is not just like a short-term business cycle dip in the demographic demand for university places, it is a long-term challenge, I think. Now, how can this system meet that challenge? I guess the first thing I know from experience is that the system alone cannot do it. It takes a dialogue between the system and the legislature, and the governor, our elected officials. And that dialogue needs to center around what it is we want the university to do for the state and how important access for students is in the state compared to other things that state has to deal with, like health insurance and roads and all the rest of it. The system, the Board of Regents, can't make those judgments. It can only put forward the trade-offs and the needs that are required in order to keep the university system functioning the way the state wants it to. And it's my perception that in the last few years that dialogue has sort of broken down. I hope these podcasts help to reinstate some of that, because the university is an important asset to the state, but it can't decide itself what the state needs. And the state can't ignore the university and still have an asset that it should be using. So having that dialogue in an honest and straightforward way is important.
I think one of the little known things about especially UW-Madison is how private donors have come alongside the state to fund it and keep it relevant and keep it this world-class institution. I think you have some thoughts about that.
Well, you asked earlier about myths. When I was the system president, I used to meet regularly with newly elected members of the legislature. And the first question I'd ask them is, how much of the university's budget do you think the taxpayers provide? And the guesses were always 70, 80, even 90%. You're a public university, after all. I think right now it's less than 20%. At Madison, probably less than that.
Yeah, Madison is 14%.
Yeah. So the question of what a public university is on the table, I think, in a sense. We have a public mission. We try to honor that. But the state has to recognize that when it's paying 14% of the bill, you can't really make 100% of the rules. And I don't think people have honestly talked about that issue as well. So, yes, there are myths about the university that are real and financial and persistent, I think. Maybe if we called ourselves a quasi-public university or something.
We've kind of gotten to that point, right?
Yeah.
Private donations for UW-Madison have surpassed state funding. I think that's just a very little known fact.
Yes. I mean, that's a very tangible measure of how much alumni and others value what the university does. And that's very gratifying. But I do worry sometimes that to some folks that is the excuse for why they can now cut further public funding, because somehow alums will step in and take care of it. So it's been a wonderful show of support for alumni, and I trust that will continue. But it's not the full answer, unless, of course, one wanted to say the long-term prognosis should be to completely privatize UW-Madison, and I don't hear anybody really talking about that.
Yeah, we don't hear that either. I think that UW-Madison is blessed to have this group of alumni who are willing to help fund it. Some of these other campuses in our system don't have that same blessing. Are they facing a situation in which they're functionally bankrupt, in your opinion?
Well, I don't know that I would say functionally bankrupt, because I haven't looked at the books. I mean, I don't know that much about their finances in detail, but I know that they are struggling, many of them, with declining enrollments, which are a consequence of this demographic trend I described. And that puts financial pressure on them. And there are various ways they can respond and have been responding. And one of those is to change their program array. One of them is to mix it up so they offer more two-year campuses and more two-year programs than they have before. Many of them have vigorously reached out to returning adult students to try to serve them. So I think we're in a period of evolution. Now, some people say, well, the simple solution is to close some campuses. And that idea has been around for a long time. It seems to me that it's, of all the possible approaches to managing capacity in the system, that is the least likely to happen. First of all, the legislature in Chapter 36 leaves to itself the sole authority to close a school. And in my experience, every time the legislature has crept up to that question, they have turned their back on it and said, we're not going to do it.
Well, that would mean one legislator have to close a school in their district, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's hard.
Exactly. But another approach to that, and one that the regents took 20 or so years ago, might be worth another look, and that is a policy called enrollment management, where the Board of Regents spread the enrollments of the system around over the campuses, all the campuses, to make use of all that infrastructure and campus facilities and all that faculty that are out there. That meant that Madison's enrollments were smaller, and the enrollments at the other four-year campuses around the state grew. But all of the facilities were used. We didn't create an economic crisis in any community by closing a campus. Madison got, I think, to some relief from pressures it was having on its laboratory space, its residence halls, all the things that were making it difficult for students at Madison at that time to graduate in 4 years. So enrollment management, or some version of it, might be worth another look. Rather than saying, let's close campuses, let's figure out how we use that infrastructure better.
Do you think, regardless of what the solution might be, do you think it's time for an organization like Badgers United or others to lead a conversation about the need for change across the system?
Yes, I think anybody who's willing to talk about change ought to feel free to do that. As you undoubtedly know, the regents are going to be looking for a new system president, and this is a good juncture at which to have some of those conversations about what is it that the system really needs and the state at this point, what kind of leadership, and what are the challenges you're recruiting somebody to face at this juncture.
If you were on the search committee, what kind of skills would you look for in the next system president?
Well, it's always a key question. I think something that's seldom talked about, but is very important to the success of a next system president, is to understand and appreciate that he or she has two constituencies. They have an external constituency, which is the public and the legislature and the governor and parents and so on. But they have an internal constituency, too, which is the faculty and the students and the staff. And those are equally important. If you're going to maintain and grow a quality university, you have to recognize both those constituencies and deal with them both up front. So that's the first thing I look for, is somebody who can appreciate that. I'd look for somebody with strong academic values, because I think otherwise you don't have the loyalty of the faculty and the academic structure that you need. And then I'd look for somebody who can deal, I guess I'd say would be a policy wonk. Somebody who can look at something like the demographic trends we're facing and identify 2 or 3 possible policies, and then go out and get people to help evaluate those and work rationally through the changes that need to be made. I would be very leery of a candidate who came to an interview for that job and said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to close Oshkosh and Platteville and blah, 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 blah. And, if you think you know ahead of time, you don't. Every university has its own culture, just like every state has its own culture. And a new person coming into the system presidency here needs to take time to learn that culture and then work with it.
I think you bring up an interesting thing with these two masters. In a world that's increasingly polarized, the faculty tend to be perceived as on the liberal side of the spectrum, while our state's constituents tend to be more on the conservative side. How do you serve those masters as a system president?
Well, it's not that hard. First of all, let me sidebar here for a minute. Here's another myth, that the faculty are all liberal.
Yep, definitely a myth.
There have been some interesting studies done by the Carnegie Foundation and the Pew Foundation a few years ago. Faculty in the sciences, in medicine, in the professions tend to vote more Republican than Democrat. Faculty in the liberal arts go the other way. Who knows? I mean, we don't and we shouldn't poll our faculty on their political affiliations. But if you could, it seems to me it's at least likely that the conservative viewpoints would equal or maybe slightly overbalance.
Now, that's a story you don't hear every day.
No, you don't. But look at the numbers. We have far more faculty in the sciences than we have in liberal arts. So if my assumption is correct, based on those Carnegie studies and other things, the university faculty is really not all liberal. I think the liberal faculty make more noise, and they get more press in some ways. When a science faculty member is in the news or something, it's usually for his research or output. And when a humanities professor is in the news, it may be about that, but it may be about his participation in some other, national organization that has liberal views. And so we get a slightly biased sense of where the faculty are on that. So that's a myth I think you should add to your list and keep your eyes open for other indications of.
So noted. That's a great learning. So I think as you are talking about this, the legislature and their need to act on the capacity issues and the new system president needing to learn, what advice do you have for these folks?
Well, I don't know. No, I don't have any silver bullet advice, but I think this is a time for people to be steadfast in their support for education and its value in our society. And I don't care how many times you point to Steve Jobs or somebody else who went straight from high school to multi-million-dollar entrepreneurship. That can always happen. It's just like you can always find the odd case or the unusual case of in athletics where somebody becomes a superstar without having gone through the B team training and so on. But that's very, very unusual, and we should not try to build a society on the assumption that everybody is going to be able to just forget about higher education and go out and become an entrepreneur and invent something. Higher education is still the key, and I was listening recently to a national report about unemployment rates, and the question was, the unemployment rate nationally is so low, why do we still have people who are fussing about unemployment? And the answer was, look at it. It's mostly white males with little or no education beyond high school that have 10% unemployment rates still. That's a disaster socially, but it's a disaster to think that education has no place in your future or building the future of the state. It's easy to overlook now because I think universities have just, through alumni support and other ways, filled in and kept going. But that's not a long-term solution, and we need to get back to a period of honest investment in higher education, I think.
So as we look at the state with declining demographics and we know that there's a need for workforce, what role do you think UW-Madison plays in contributing to the solution of that problem?
Well, Madison is producing a remarkable number of special talents in research, in biology, in medicine, in engineering, in computer science now. And those are talents that are going to find employment in the state, I hope, but certainly in the nation and maybe internationally. Without Madison, we would be looking, as a state, we would be looking to other states or more to international immigrant, talented immigrant labor to build and grow our economy. So Madison's very important in that spectrum of resources that we have to face the future.
So as a former system president, I have to believe that you have a position on the current tuition freeze and its impact on the system.
Yes, I don't think any business, and the university is a business, it's a big business, can run with prices frozen indefinitely. I understand the political appeal of doing that. If you're a legislator, it's cheaper than funding the university. But in the end, what it's going to do is reduce access for residents of the state. It will reduce the quality of some programs or result in the elimination of some programs that can no longer be supported. And that's not a good way to do it. And in the end, when the freeze comes off, you've got this big increase in tuition that would be necessary to bring us up to what our peers are charging. So I think it's far better, rather than freezing tuition, to gradually increase it every year, or most years. And we don't have to be exactly where our peers are, but we need to be tracking along with them, or we're going to find ourselves with fewer opportunities for our students. That's not where we want to go.
One of these opportunities that you talk about is, I believe, is research. And recently it came out that UW-Madison had dropped in the ranking of research expenditures to number 8 from number 5. We were number 2 for decades before that. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I'm worried about that. The research budget of the university is almost entirely self-generated. That is, the university gets research funds by having hundreds and hundreds of faculty write grant proposals, submit them competitively to foundations and national organizations, and win those competitions. When we start dropping in our success rates in those competitions, it's a sign that we're losing key faculty, and it's also a sign that the competition is not. Or maybe it's a sign that they're hiring our key faculty in some cases. So that research budget drives all kinds of ancillary spending locally in the state, and is a real engine of growth. So it's a worry if it starts to decline. And I know the chancellor's working on it and the deans are working on it. But the key to that is for faculty to have the stature to compete nationally for those grants.
So I think you bring up something about faculty that's interesting to know. We're 15.6% behind our peers in faculty pay. Mm-hmm. Who do you consider our peers?
You've just asked a question that has historically plagued the system for a long time. You may know that. When I first came to the system, we were having the so-called Great Catch-Up debate, where the legislature and the governor had said they were willing to provide funds to catch up the faculty to our peers. And so then, of course, the question was, who are the peers? There was a commission appointed, I was part of it, to define peer groups for campuses, including Madison. And we did that. And there was all kinds of argumentation and struggle over who the peer groups were. But for Madison, the peer groups are basically other public research universities, some but not all in the Midwest. And if you were to redo that peer group today, and please don't put me on the commission when you do that.
We'll tell them you're not interested.
If you were to redo that peer group today, certainly there would have to be consideration of putting some international universities on that list as well. So Madison has stature as a research university way beyond the size of our state. It is recognized nationally and internationally, and that means that if you're going to try to pay faculty roughly at their peer levels, you've got to consider beyond just Minnesota.
Right. Yeah.
And I know the chancellor has been working to upgrade faculty salaries. It's an important value for her. It was an important value for me the whole time I was assistant president, and the Board of Regents were very vigorous in saying that we had to maintain that median peer structure.
It's also interesting. We have covered a ton of ground here. Mm-hmm. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, there are many things, but I think we've spread just about as far as we can here.
Well, we thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate having you here today.
Thank you.
This has been an episode of Badgers United Podcast, the flagship, where we work with thought leaders in higher education to make sense of the complex policy web that governs our state's largest university. Please follow us on Twitter at Badgers_United, sign up for our mailing list on our website, badgersunited.org, and subscribe to the flagship wherever you get your podcasts.